What's up, everybody? Jason Swenk here, and I have an amazing guest where we're going to talk about bootstrapping your agency and how to grow it. So I'm excited to get into it. So let's jump into the show. Hey, Rich, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Yeah, man, excited to have you on. So let's kind of jump into, how have you been able to bootstrap a lot of these companies? So you've done let's talk about some of the companies that you've done and how you've bootstrapped them and grew them over the years.
Well, I guess bootstrapping is done regardless of the business. So we've done everything from email newsletters, right? Email marketing, basically, back in the early 90s, like 93. I ran an ISP out of my house with 300 phone lines coming in. I've ran click networks. I've ran contest search engines and now an ad fraud solution. And the bootstrapping technique for me has always been the same. You know, take what little resources you have, and most of my companies have had just a couple $1,000 to get started, and really, do as much of the work as you possibly can yourself. Even if it comes to web design, learn it yourself, or you hire some people that can do it very inexpensively, because you got to protect that what little budget you have, and start the company, get the company started, right? As I've started to see a little bit of success in small pockets of each of the different companies, and each company is a little different, but when I start making a little bit of profit from something that I'm running, zero in on that to make sure it's actually profitable and it's not just a fluke, and slowly start to scale that up. As I was able to scale up stuff like that, first go back to 93 when my email newsletter. Um, I was writing a newsletter and actually it wasn't for profit, it was just for fun. I was enthralled with the internet. Internet was launched in 91 for public consumption. I think it was September 1st of 91. 93, I got started, and I started writing articles on all the new things that were happening and what was making it, because I knew this was going to change the world. I was hooked day one. And so I started with just writing a letter because I thought, like a newsletter, that I thought it was interesting and I thought people would be interested in it. And back then, within a couple of months, I had over 20,000 subscribers, which back then was a lot considering the makeup of the network and everything. There was
Were
no
they all
World Wide
AOL
Web.
email addresses?
Yes, yes. What ended up happening was I was a big chatter in the EOL chat rooms, and I would jump in the chat room and just say, "Hey, I've got a newsletter talking about the changing internet. If anybody's interested, sign up here." And that's all I did. And I ended up getting 20,000 subscribers that way. Back then they didn't call it opt-in, but it was all opt-in. And I just started writing because it was something I found interesting, and I'm not a writer by any stretch of the imagination, but it was something that I wanted to do. And probably once I broke about 10,000 subscribers, somebody said, "Hey, can I advertise in your newsletter?" And I thought, sure, why not? And so I tested it on one article I wrote, and I had one person advertise in it, and obviously it was all profit because there was no cost on my part. I was just my internet connection, and that was pretty much my total overhead for the month, and I made money. And I'm like, wow, this is pretty cool. And as I'm analyzing, saying, wow, this might be a business model, because the model didn't really exist back then. All of a sudden, after the first article I posed, I got 3 or 4 more people said, "Hey, can I advertise in your newsletter?" And so again, I started the company with buying some software to help me manage the list. I had my AOL connection, my normal internet connection, some hardware upgrades that I needed to do. So that was my initial cost, and we put a couple $100 into it, nothing crazy. And before you knew it, I was making a couple thousand a week. Just people wanted to advertise in the newsletter, and that started the growth from there. And then what was interesting, again, bootstrapping the whole way. Somebody again said, "Hey, the World Wide Web is out now. Maybe you can start a mall. I'd be happy to sign up and have a store in your mall," because that was kind of the thing back then. So I put a newsletter out, said, "Hey, we're going to put together a web mall. I'm going to basically build you a website, give you 3 pages, do all the design work, host it for X number of dollars. If you're interested, send me money." It was that poor of a campaign, and I got something like in the first week I got like 8 or 10 grand. So took a week off from work because, of course, I was still working full time, and read 2,000 pages of HTML and graphic design, and put together the whole mall, wrote all the 50 or 60 websites, whatever it was, when it was all said and done, and finished it up in a week. And the mall was launched and we were up and running. And that's how I bootstrapped into that. And all of a sudden we started growing a web development business, you know. Then the next thing was people like, hey, I see that you guys do web development services. Do you offer a way to connect to the internet? I'm like, all right, I'm sure I can figure this out. So I ordered a couple hundred phone lines into my house from Verizon, got a T1 routed to my house. There was a big story behind that, but you just kind of taken one success and rolled it into the next, and that's how I've always done my stuff. So if I came up with an idea, and not all my ideas were successful, but you came up with an idea, you test the waters small. And if there's a provability, then run a bigger test. And if that continues to prove itself, just keep growing that and scaling that as fast as you can with budget you have naturally. You know, you don't want to start taking loans or bringing on partners. You know, I haven't, I have not had any luck, going after funding and stuff like that. So I've always had to bootstrap, and you just continue to parlay your success into it, the next success, into the next success, until next thing you know, we end up selling that company. So again, I'll start bootstrapping. One of my more successful companies, we started with $5,000 and just took a while to parlay each little success into the next test, trying to find out what campaigns worked, until the next thing you know, you're doing really well. You're winning Inc. 500, awards, winning Ernst & Young awards. I mean, you start winning all this other stuff and people are recognizing what you're doing, and it all started with a $5,000 investment. So you can definitely bootstrap your way to big money. But you've got to be very careful with how you do it. It's always just testing the wins. And like, I'll remember the first one. I'll give you an example. I ran a campaign that I was testing, and I made 10 cents. And I was flipping out. I was like, this is great. My wife's like, you made 10 cents, big deal. I'm like, but you don't understand. I only spent, 2.5 cents to make that 10 cents. Now, if I can multiply that by a factor of, 100,000 or 1 million, we could make some money. But this looks like a scalable, and like, she couldn't understand, like, initially why I was jumping up and down about, 7.5 cents profit. But when it's 75% profit, and you start doing the math, and then you start proving that it is a scalable solution, things get a lot more exciting. But again, testing something as simple as a 10-cent campaign, with a 7.5 cent win, to me, I get excited about as a bootstrapper.
How that leads me to kind of think about, because yeah, I mean, in the early days, I would be like, well, yeah, who cares about the couple cents? But how are you able to kind of multiply that by 1 million?
And that's the trick. Like I said, it's if you pick out, whenever I talk to clients, from an agency voice, I explain to them there's two things. There's your profit margin, and then there's profit, right? You pay your bills with profit, not with margin. So a lot of times people are so hung up with trying to, kill the margin and make, 60, 70, 80% margin on a campaign, that at that margin level, there's just not enough room to scale it. So maybe you're making $2 on that campaign for the month. You can't do anything with $2, even though you have a killer margin. So what I always try to talk to my agency guys about, and the buyers, is there's a good balance between your margin and your profit. You pay bills with profit. So I would rather give up margin so I can scale it, versus focusing on, killing the margin and not being able to scale it. So it's depending on the campaign, depending on the business model, there's a lot you have to contend with. And again, it's hard to talk in generalities because there's just so many different business model types, but you got to prove something that works and find the scaling point. Like, don't worry so much about the margin, worry more about how much cash you're going to put in your pocket that month, because that's how you pay your bills and that's how you make money.
Yeah, I always tell everybody, it's like, when you're scaling, you don't have to worry about that as much. Like, they'll be like, oh, if we dip below this certain percentage, then, hey, we're in the red. I'm like, but you're doing this for the long term, and you can actually, like, you're investing in the number one resource, that you can, rather than putting it in the stock market or putting it somewhere else. And so I'm like, hey man, go do it. What This has all been amazing, Rich. Is there anything I didn't ask you that you think would benefit the audience listening in?
Uh, Bootstrapping, I've seen lots of companies do very well bootstrapping. I've seen lots of companies do very well with investors and getting, raising capital. And I always point like, if you have a really good, unique idea that's hard to enter into the marketplace because you've got some unique IP or something like that, sometimes going after funding is the right way to go. Like, look at the big companies that we all know. How many of them bootstrapped? Very few, right? They always got to a certain inflection point where they said, okay, now it's time to bring, and there's a certain point where it makes sense to bring on outside money so that you can really scale something fast. If Facebook didn't bring on investors, we may not have heard about it. It may not have been as big as it is. They blew up once they brought on their investors who had, different relationships, different ideas, different experience in managing a company at that level. So, for a bootstrapper, in the very beginning, when you're first figuring out your business model, first figuring out your margins and everything else, you got to be a sponge and you got to be willing. It's not like, hey, I own a business, I can sit back and work the hours I want. That doesn't work bootstrapping. You got to bust your ass. You got to be working 70, 80, 90 hours a week to learn everything and do everything that needs to get done, because you can't afford to buy, in other words, you can't afford to bring in a high-end CFO to help you manage funds. You can't afford to do that. You have to do that yourself. Maybe you have that skill, maybe you don't, but you have to sit back and learn as much of the areas that you don't know about. Maybe you don't know about content marketing. Maybe you don't know about SEO. You need to learn it because you can't afford to pay someone else. The only thing you do have is your time, and you don't have a lot of money to invest as a most bootstrappers don't have a lot of money to invest. So you really have to focus on learning everything you don't know. And the more you learn, the more you realize you don't know. So you've got to really spend the time, a good chunk of your time, learning every aspect of your business in order to how to grow it. Podcasts like this are awesome because, when I was growing up in the business, there were no podcasts. There were no people that you can turn to. You couldn't connect with, people who knew the space very well easily. Unless you knew their phone number, you weren't getting in touch with them. So, today's, entrepreneurs that are coming up in the space that are bootstrapping have access to all this great content, tidbits like this, 10, 12-minute podcasts that they can absorb and pick up some information from experts who've done it for years. That is invaluable information. And you really got to get plugged into the right places to learn as much as you can about the areas that you don't know so you can grow your business without having to go hire someone to do it.
No. Love it. What's a website, or how can people get in touch with you if they want to chat with you?
I'm on LinkedIn. I've got a huge following, and I post on almost on a daily basis on LinkedIn, just Rich Khan, or you can find me all the contact information at Anora.io, which is the current company that I'm growing at this point.
Awesome. Well, everyone go check that out. And Rich, thanks so much for coming on the show. If you guys enjoyed this episode and you want to fast track your agency a little bit more and you want to know some of the systems, some of the framework that's working for agencies, that's worked for me and what I would actually use again, I want you guys to go to jasonswank.com/playbook and request an invite and check out all the systems that we have. That's jasonswank.com/playbook. And until next time, have a swank day.